Okay, so my sister-in-law slapped me at my own anniversary dinner in front of my own kids because I served myself a plate of food before she'd gotten hers. "You forget your place in this family," she snapped, hands still raised like she was proud of it. My husband looked away, didn't stand up, didn't say one single word in my defense. So I set down my fork, wiped my hands on the linen napkin I'd ironed myself that morning, and I slapped her back, harder, without a shred of hesitation. Then I turned to the man I'd loved since I was 22 and said, "A husband who cannot defend his wife in front of a room full of people does not deserve to remain her husband." I took my daughter's hand in one of mine, my son's in the other, and I walked out of the house I'd paid for, still in the dress I'd bought for the occasion. 2 years later, the same family that told me to remember my place would be the ones learning, the hardest way possible, exactly what theirs was. My name's Vanessa Sterling. I grew up in a house with a circular driveway. My father built half the office parks in our county, from nothing but a construction loan and pure stubbornness. Never wanted for anything material growing up. What I wanted, the one thing money couldn't buy, was a love that felt like it belonged to me, not to a spreadsheet. Not arranged, not brokered, not chosen for some merger between two families with matching bank accounts. I found that love in Nathaniel Cross when I was 22, in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my college apartment, on an ordinary rainy Tuesday that somehow became the beginning of everything. He was nothing like the polished men my mother paraded past me at country club lunches. Nathaniel drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, worked long, unglamorous hours at a mid-sized architecture firm, sketching buildings he didn't yet have the seniority to design himself. Made me laugh so hard that first afternoon I spilled my drink across the table, onto both of us. Neither of us cared. Talked for 4 hours. Missed a study group I'd promised to attend. Didn't think about it once until the next morning. My father was skeptical of him, the quiet way fathers get skeptical of men who show up without a resume attached to their name. My mother worried, more than once, that a man marrying into money sometimes learns to just tolerate the woman for the sake of everything around her. I told her she was wrong. Standing in my parents' kitchen, defending a man I'd known 8 months, I was so certain she just didn't understand what I'd found. We married in a small ceremony my parents paid for, in a garden behind my grandmother's old church. Nathaniel's family attended with this strange, watchful stiffness I mistook at the time for shyness. Wasn't shyness, was calculation, quiet and patient. And I didn't have the vocabulary yet to recognize it for what it was. His mother, Rosalind, ran her household like a court in miniature. His older sister, Prudence, uncontested crown princess of it. Unmarried, financially dependent on the family catering business her late husband had left behind, and quietly resentful of anyone who threatened to shift the family's center of gravity even an inch. I was that threat, whether I meant to be or not. A woman with her own money, her own opinions, and a husband who, in those early years, actually looked at me like I mattered more than his sister's approval. That didn't last nearly as long as I wanted it to. I remember the first real crack clearly because I've replayed it so many times since. Our second Thanksgiving as a married couple. I'd spent the entire day cooking a meal from a recipe card in my late grandmother's handwriting. Prudence picks at the stuffing, sets down her fork with a small, deliberate clink against the china, and says to the table at large, "It's sweet when some people try so hard to prove they belong somewhere they clearly weren't born into." Everyone laughs. That small, uncomfortable laugh people give when they know exactly what was meant and choose not to acknowledge it. Nathaniel reaches for the gravy boat, changes the subject to football. I sit there holding my water glass too tightly and say nothing. Next year, at my son Miles' christening, Rosalind corners me near the coat closet while I'm still holding my newborn. Gentle's possible voice tells me that money can buy a beautiful nursery, dear, but it can't buy manners. Says she worries sometimes about what our grandchildren would absorb from being around it so much. I stand there rocking my infant son, say nothing back. I'd already learned by then that arguing only made the room colder for days afterward, and Nathaniel never once talked it back out on his own. Another moment, 2 years later, at Rosalind's birthday. I'd quietly covered the entire catering bill after Prudence's business, the same one, supposedly thriving, came up short at the last minute. Nobody thanked me. Prudence just remarked, loud enough for the caterers themselves to hear, that it was nice Vanessa finally found a use for all that family money besides decorating. I laughed along that night. Laughing along had become its own quiet survival skill. Dozens of these moments, scattered across the years, small, precise cuts, delivered with a smile, always in front of an audience large enough to make any response feel like an overreaction. Always followed by my husband's particular brand of silence. Not agreement, just a steady refusal to spend even a single ounce of his own comfort defending mine. I told myself, year after year, it was worth it. Love meant absorbing a few sharp words for the sake of family unity, for the sake of my kids having grandparents, for the sake of the man I'd chosen over every safer option my parents had once quietly lined up for me. I told myself a great many things over 11 years of marriage. Every single one, a small necessary lie, so I could keep loving him without the resentment eating me alive. We had 2 kids by then. My daughter Charlotte, 8 and sharp as a blade. My son Miles, 6, who worshipped his father with that uncomplicated devotion only small boys seem capable of. I'd built my own career too. Boutique interior design firm that, over the years, had quietly started to eclipse Nathaniel's income from the architecture firm. I never rubbed that in his face. Never made him feel small for it. Not even the months I covered the entire mortgage myself. My design work kept me traveling, site visits, installations, buying trips out of state. Nathaniel had naturally taken over most of our day-to-day banking somewhere along the way. Small, practical arrangement that felt like teamwork at the time. I just kept smoothing over every awkward silence his family created, because I believed a marriage was a thing you protected. Even in the years it had clearly stopped protecting you back. The house we lived in, colonial, wraparound porch, the kind of thing Prudence loved to comment on like she owned some invisible share of it, had been bought with help from my side. My father covered the down payment as a wedding gift, and I funded every renovation since, room by room, with money I earned myself. On paper, the house belonged to both Nathaniel and me equally. In practice, Rosalind and Prudence treated it like a family asset I was merely being permitted to live inside of, provided I behaved myself and remembered whose name carried more weight at that table. I didn't yet understand how literally they meant that last part. Our 11th anniversary fell on a Saturday in early autumn. I wanted, for once, to celebrate it the way I remembered our very first years. Warm, unguarded, entirely ours. Nathaniel asks the week before if his mother and sister could join us, just this once, because it means something to Rosalind to be included, because I was, even after everything, still trying. I said yes. I spent 3 days preparing that dinner. Roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, a wild rice dish my mother taught me as a girl, a chocolate torte I'd practiced twice before getting the texture right, set the table myself, pressed the linens myself, picked fresh flowers from my mother's garden that morning. Rosalind arrives first, trailing her fingers along the linen, the way a woman audits a business she's never trusted to succeed. Prudence arrives 20 minutes late, exactly as she always does, settles into the seat at the head of the table that Nathaniel quietly lets her have, in our house, on our anniversary, without a glance in my direction. I let it go. I always let it go. Food's ready, I serve the kids first. Move quickly so nothing goes cold. Then, at last, I serve myself. Sit down. I've barely lifted my fork when Prudence's open hand crosses the table and strikes my cheek. My ears ring. Vision blurs white at the edges for a full second. "You forget your place in this family," she says, loud enough that Charlotte's fork clatters against her plate. Miles freezes mid-bite. Room goes silent except for my own pulse behind my eyes. I look at Nathaniel. Look at the man I married for love, whose family I'd fed and funded and quietly forgiven for 11 straight years. He looks down at his own plate, like the tablecloth held something more urgent than his wife's reddening face. Something in me that had been cracking slowly for over a decade finally gives way. I set down my fork, wipe my hands on my napkin, slowly. The way you move when your body needs a moment to catch up with the decision your mind's already made. Then I reach across the table and strike Prudence back, the full weight of 11 years of silence behind it. The gasp that travels around the table almost makes me laugh, like I'm the one who broke some sacred rule. I stand up, look at Nathaniel, not Prudence, not Rosalind, and say the words that have been sitting coiled in my chest for years. A husband who cannot defend his wife in front of a room full of people does not deserve to remain her husband. He doesn't argue, doesn't apologize, sits there stunned, like a man who'd never once considered that his silence might carry a cost. I take Charlotte's hand in mine, Miles's in the other, and walk both my kids out of that dining room, out of that house, into my car. Still wearing the dress I'd bought for the two of us, I drive straight to my parents' place, 40 minutes away. My mother opens the door before I even knock, takes one look at my face, says, "Come in, baby, you're safe here now." My parents' house had always felt like a fortress of a different kind. Not the sort built to keep me in line, the sort built to keep me protected. My mother makes up the guest wing for me and the kids within a single day, doesn't even ask how long we'd be staying. My father hugs me tight enough that I feel, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, entirely unafraid. Nathaniel calls that night, then the next morning, then every few hours after, until my phone's buzzing, nearly hot in my pocket. I let most of it go to voicemail. When I finally answer, 3 days later, sitting alone on my parents' back porch, he's full of the kind of apology that comes dressed up as love, but is really just fear of consequence. I should have said something. I know that now. I'm sorry. We can fix this. My family will apologize. Please just come home. The kids need their father. I ask him one question. How many times, Nathaniel? How many times over 11 years have you watched your mother or your sister humiliate me at my own table? And said absolutely nothing. He doesn't have an answer, because we both already knew it by heart, too many to count. I'd stopped counting somewhere around year 4, because counting made it far too painful to keep staying. Those first strange, quiet weeks, I leaned harder than I expected on my business partner, Priya. Steady woman who'd built the design firm alongside me from a 2-desk office into something that now employed 11 people. She shows up on my parents' porch the Sunday after the dinner with takeout and no questions. Sits with me while the kids nap. Says, "I've watched you carry that family for a decade. Whatever you decide now, the firm carries you." Such a small thing to say, and it undid me completely, because it was the first time in years somebody had told me I was allowed to be carried, instead of doing all the carrying myself. I file for divorce 11 days after the anniversary dinner. Hire an attorney named Franklin Wells, sharp, unflappable man my father had trusted for decades of business dealings. Tell him plainly what I want. My children, my house, and the truth about what that family had actually been doing to us for over a decade. By then, a quiet suspicion had formed that there was more than cruelty hiding underneath Rosalind and Prudence's contempt. I suspected there was money involved somewhere. I was right, though I had no idea yet how deep it went, or how long it'd take to fully untangle. It's Franklin who finds it first, buried in the financial disclosures required for the divorce. Over the past 4 years, more than $66,000 had moved out of our joint household account in small, irregular transfers. Never large enough on their own to raise a flag, and easy to miss, given that Nathaniel had handled most of our monthly banking for years while my work kept me on the road. The money had gone to Prudence, not as gifts, as loans, never repaid, funneled quietly through Nathaniel to keep his sister's catering business afloat. A business Rosalind had bankrolled for years and refused to let die, even as it bled money behind a polished storefront. Nathaniel had signed off on these transfers using an account I'd funded almost entirely with my own earnings, without ever telling me where the money actually went. That discovery, painful as it was, wasn't the worst of it. Buried deeper in the paperwork, a notarized quitclaim form, dated 18 months earlier, attempting to transfer a 10% ownership stake in our house, the house my own father had helped me buy, into Rosalind's name. My signature sat at the bottom of the page, in ink I had never put there. Franklin brings in a forensic document examiner who flags inconsistent pressure patterns and pen lift points that didn't match my genuine signature on file with our mortgage lender. Convincing forgery. Not a perfect one. Franklin's careful to warn me even then not to expect a fast resolution. A forgery case like this, he said, would need to move through the recorder's office, then possibly a criminal referral. And that kind of process rarely moves quickly, no matter how strong the evidence looks on day one. County Recorder's Office confirms something that stops me cold. Their own routine verification process had actually flagged the transfer months earlier, quietly held it pending documentation that was never provided. It'd never fully gone through, but the attempt itself was real, deliberate, and, per Franklin, very likely a criminal matter the DA's office would need months, not weeks, to properly evaluate. Franklin walks me through what that timeline would actually look like, sitting across his desk with a legal pad covered in small, careful handwriting. Recorder's office would need to formally document the flag transfer, hand over their internal records. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit would need to interview the notary who processed the form, figure out whether she'd been deceived or was somehow complicit. Bank records tied to the original notarization fee would need to be subpoenaed. None of it, he told me plainly, would move at the pace of the divorce itself, which was already moving faster than most. I remember nodding along in his office, absorbing the idea that I might spend the next several years of my life still hearing updates about this case. Scattered phone calls long after the custody paperwork was signed and the moving boxes were unpacked. I remember calling my father that evening, sitting alone in my car in Franklin's parking garage, because I couldn't bring myself to say the words inside my parents' house where the kids might overhear. My father listens without interrupting, the way he'd always listened when I was small. When I finally finish, he says only, "You built that house with your own 2 hands as much as any contractor did. Nobody takes that from you while I'm still breathing." Wasn't a legal strategy, was simply what I needed to hear. Then Franklin finds a second thread, one none of us expected, cross-referencing county records out of habit. He discovers Rosalind had attempted a nearly identical quitclaim maneuver once before, decades earlier, against her own late husband's sister in a property dispute that had quietly settled out of public view. Wasn't a single lapse in judgment. Was a pattern she'd simply been waiting for the right, unwatched moment to repeat. One more piece, and it came from a place I never expected. A former employee of Prudence's catering business, young woman named Nadia, who'd quit 2 years earlier after going unpaid for a month, reaches out to Franklin's office once word of the investigation quietly reached her. She'd kept copies of invoices she'd once been asked to inflate for family events, including my own anniversary dinner, so a portion of what I'd paid could be quietly redirected. Small amount compared to everything else, but it confirmed something I'd begun to suspect all along. Nothing about that family's warmth toward me had ever been entirely what it appeared to be. Nadia tells Franklin, almost as an afterthought during their second conversation, that she'd watched Prudence do the same thing to at least one other client over the years. A wedding client who never realized the final invoice didn't match what had actually been delivered. Franklin notes it for the record, though it never became part of our case directly. Just confirmed one more time that this had never been a single lapse born out of desperation. It was simply how that family operated when they thought nobody outside it was paying close enough attention. The next 2 years unfold slower than I wanted, and in some ways faster than I feared. Franklin refers the forged quitclaim to the district attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, and the recorder's office cooperates fully, providing their internal flag records as evidence the filing had been caught before completion. Nathaniel, confronted with the transfer records, insists he hadn't known about the forgery itself, only about the loans to his sister, which he still called helping family. Like 11 years of my quiet generosity hadn't already been exactly that, given freely without ever once being asked to sign anything away. I didn't fully believe him. By that point, it no longer mattered to me whether I did. Custody proceedings moved forward on the strength of a pattern I hadn't realized I'd been documenting for years. Photographs, calendar entries, messages showing I'd managed every school event, every doctor's appointment, every midnight fever, while Nathaniel consistently deferred to his mother's opinions about how our kids should be raised. Court awards me primary custody, structured parenting schedule for Nathaniel, and a requirement that he complete a full accounting of where the missing $66,000 had gone before certain visitation terms would be finalized. Charlotte struggles more than Miles in those early months. Old enough to sense something had fundamentally shifted, too young to have words for it. She asks me once, curled against my side on the sofa, whether it was her fault, whether serving her own plate too had somehow made things worse that night. I hold her face in both my hands, tell her nothing about that dinner had ever been about a plate. It had been about a woman who needed someone smaller than her to feel powerful over. Never for 1 second anything Charlotte had done wrong. Miles, in his own 6-year-old way, just asks when he'd get his own room back. I promise him a version of home that didn't exist yet, but that I intended to build regardless. By the second year, both kids had settled into a rhythm that felt, to my quiet relief, almost entirely ordinary. Charlotte joins a soccer team at her new school. Comes home most afternoons talking more about a girl named Hazel on her team than about anything that happened at that dinner table. Miles stops asking about his old room altogether once his new one fills up with the same dinosaur posters and half-broken toy trucks he'd always loved. And I realize, watching him build an entire city out of couch cushions one Saturday afternoon, that kids absorb far more resilience from a stable home than they ever do from a complicated one held together by silence. The house, my house, gets restored fully to my name once the forensic examiner's report is accepted by the family court, and Rosalind's ownership claim is formally voided by the county. The criminal referral against her moves slower, exactly as Franklin warned it would. As of this telling, the DA's office is still building that case. Franklin says matters like this can take years before anyone sees the inside of a courtroom. The civil result, though, already done. Nathaniel, rather than fight a fraud investigation that would have pulled his mother and sister further into it, agrees to a settlement including full restitution of the diverted funds, paid in structured installments. Prudence's catering business folds within the first year, finally cut off from money that had never truly been hers to give away. A handful of her longtime clients later tell mutual acquaintances they'd suspected something was off about her billing for years, but never wanted to be the one to raise it publicly. Rosalind, facing the real possibility of her own exposure over both the recent quitclaim attempt and the decades-old pattern Franklin had unearthed, retreats from any further contact with me entirely. Not out of remorse, I suspect, out of fear of what continued proximity might now cost her. Word travels through the extended family quietly, the way it always does. My father's older brother, a retired judge who'd always kept a polite distance from Nathaniel's side of the family, calls me directly once he hears about the quitclaim. Tells me he'd never trusted Rosalind's warmth. Not once, in all the years he'd watched her operate at family gatherings. Nathaniel's own younger cousin, soft-spoken man named Oliver, who'd always been kind to me in the background, sends me a short private message once the story became impossible for the family to keep quiet. Says he's sorry, that he'd noticed things over the years, never said a word. I appreciated it. Even as I recognized it for what it was, another version of the same silence I'd lived inside of for 11 years. Just arriving more gently, and far too late to change anything. Somewhere in the middle of that second year, while the criminal referral sat quietly in a queue at the DA's office, and the custody schedule finally settled into a rhythm the kids could count on, I noticed something shift in myself I hadn't expected. My design firm grew faster in those 2 years than it had in the previous 5 combined. Clients start asking gently why my work suddenly felt bolder, less careful, less concerned with pleasing every possible taste in a room. I didn't have a clever answer for them. I just knew that a version of me who no longer spent half her energy managing someone else's family had a great deal more energy left over for everything else. Nathaniel asks to see me once more before the divorce is finalized. He sits across from me in Franklin's conference room, older somehow than he looked 2 years earlier, and says the words that, once, years ago, I'd have given almost anything to hear. I'm sorry for all of it. I should have chosen you every single time, and I didn't. I believe in the moment that he means it. But an apology offered only after the money's found and the papers are signed isn't repentance. It's damage control, arriving years too late to mean what it might once have meant. I'd spent 11 years forgiving smaller versions of that same silence, hoping each time the next slight would be the one that changed him. The anniversary dinner had simply been the last straw on a decade-long pile of them, and I was done handing out forgiveness for free. I know, I told him quietly, but I'm not the same woman who kept forgiving you for it. I have no interest in going back to being her. The divorce is finalized on a gray Tuesday. I walk out of that courthouse holding both my children's hands, same way I'd walked them out of that dining room 2 years earlier. Except this time, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward the rest of our lives, in a house that finally, fully belonged only to us. Priya throws a small dinner for me, and the kids the week the divorce finalized. Nothing elaborate, just her own kitchen table, crowded with mismatched chairs and too much food. But it was the first anniversary of any kind I'd celebrated in years, where every person at the table actually wanted me there. I served myself first that night, without thinking twice. Nobody so much as blinks. My mother sits across from me that evening, watching my kids argue happily over the last dinner roll, tells me quietly she hadn't seen me laugh that easily in over a decade. She was right. I hadn't even noticed the difference in myself until she said it out loud. Charlotte asked me recently why Aunt Prudence doesn't come to her birthday parties anymore. I told her the truth in words an 8-year-old could carry. Some people forget that love isn't something you're allowed to take for granted just because someone keeps giving it freely. Sometimes the people who love us most have to be the ones who finally teach them where that giving stops. I think about that dinner often. Not the slap itself. I've never regretted returning it. I think about the silence that came right before it. 11 years of silence from the one person who was supposed to stand between me and a room full of people trying to put me in my place. I learned, in the end, that the place I truly belonged was never at the foot of someone else's table, waiting for my turn to be fed scraps of respect. It was at the head of my own. If someone in your own family has ever made you feel like you needed to earn a seat at a table you were already rightfully sitting at, what would it finally take for you to stand up and walk away for good?